Welcome to Tomorrow Talks, a conversation where we in a moment will be joined by one of the most prominent voices on human rights. You are watching Tomorrow Talks, a collaboration between Danish sustainability platform Tomorrow and Tortoise Media, our London-based media platform. This is where we speak to some of the great system changers around the world. And we ask them to help us convert our good intentions on sustainable behavior into real and tangible actions. Together with some of the sharpest minds that inspire us the most in our work, we are looking for answers on how we can become part of a sustainable tomorrow, but starting that today. And to get us going in this conversation and to give perspectives on what we know about the fight for sustainable transformation with human rights at its heart, we have Zeid joining us today. I'm very thrilled to having Zeid here. Zeid was the human rights chief from 2014 to 18 and served as a diplomat on behalf of his country, Jordan, for many years. Among other roles, was ambassador to the United Nations in New York. Zeid, you're currently the Perry World House Professor at the University of Pennsylvania for the practice of law and human rights. And you've also been appointed as a member of the elders. We're thrilled to have you and look very much forward to embarking on this conversation about human rights and how it intersects with climate change. I would love to kick us off with sort of a broader question, if I may, Zeid, and maybe just start us off with talking about the linkages between human rights and climate.
Well, I'm delighted to be participating in this discussion and to be the inaugural speaker. Thank you, Alexandra, for the warm welcome. The linkages are both direct and indirect. It is quite evident, and it is framed in the context of climate justice. It's referred to as climate justice. But it is evident that those who will suffer the most, over whose necks the axe of climate change will fall first, are the marginalized communities, those communities that live on the brink of existence as we stand today, are those who are likely to suffer from continued droughts, the collapsing biodiversity that we see around us, will be forced to move because of famines that will continue. Pandemics are likely to be more the norm than the exception, as we've seen in the last 2 years. And so the people who suffer the greatest are those who live sort of with their rights being denied in the first place. And there is another trajectory, the second one, and that is that when we speak of climate justice, it's intergenerational. We have lived the benefits of a carbon economy in the industrialized world, when others have not and have lived, again, marginal existences. And we expect our children to pay the debt. It's a giant, in effect, Ponzi scheme, where they will be asked to make good on the ills of our living, and if I can put it in that way. And so the connection between human rights and climate change take those forms.
If you could, thank you, Zeid. I'm just wondering if I could take you back, if I may, to climate justice itself, and if you could explain to us, how you defined climate justice. What is the thinking around climate justice today? If you could take us a bit deeper into that.
Yeah. So when I visited the Pacific a few years ago in my capacity as human rights chief, it was clear that the islands are quickly and rapidly disappearing. These islands don't have, these states don't have the financial wherewithal to radically modify and change their existence, and they need the support of the international community. What tends to happen when we face an existential threat, as we've seen with this particular pandemic, is that there is a resurgence of this me first panic that drives human behavior, as opposed to basically identifying the problem together and then finding the solution together and then working together to address any potential future reoccurrence. We're not good at that. There's a selfishness of human behavior that is always constant, and making itself felt. It's similar in many countries. You notice that those who are moving, those who suffer starvation, are not the urban elites for whom climate change could be, in the extreme, perhaps an inconvenience. They can travel elsewhere. They have homes elsewhere. They can travel to a climate or let's say weather patterns which are better for living. The poor are the ones who suffer disproportionately, and if we're going to somehow redress this balance, we must find a radically different way of living, in part sort of anchored by the Sustainable Development Goals, but probably we'd have to go much further than that. When we look at what's required in terms of carbon mitigation, these are drastic changes in terms of lifestyle. If we're going to reach, zero net emissions by 2050, or at least 45% reduction of carbon emissions, on the basis of where we were in 2010 by 2045. Sorry. So the challenges are very, very great, and the connection, the nexus with human rights is very direct.
I mean, if I may just dwell on that point about the radical change that we as individuals need to take as corporations and as nations. And there's sort of two questions, if okay. One is, some of the things that you've been talking about previously in previous conversations was sort of reaching back to looking at some of the philosophical underpinnings when looking at the interplay between people and the planet. So I'd love if you might be able to take us back to some of that sort of fundamental thinking about the rights vis-a-vis each other, and then maybe forward to the sort of the radical change that we need to make, as you were touching upon the issue of not traveling or not eating meat, but actually it's really, really urgent if we want to exist on this planet going forward. So I wonder if you could try and make that arc on sort of that sort of deeper thinking a long time ago and where we are today.
Yes, I think this is best encapsulated in the writings of Yuval Harari, the Israeli historian, who basically explains to us the trajectory in the way that the human species has advanced from being a hunter-gatherer to being a farmer. And in the last 200 years, we've essentially pillaged the planet. We've dug up every resource we can find and fed it into a manufacturing process, which through our ingenuity and our understanding of science has led to enormous advances for humankind, but at the expense of biodiversity. The UN in September 2020 issued its fifth biodiversity outlook report, and basically there were 20 biodiversity goals set out in 2010, which and none were met by 2020. Some were partially met. And what the UN was essentially saying is that the biodiversity is collapsing at a rate that is desperately worrisome to us. We can no longer just pillage this planet to the extent where we are now under some existential threat. The Aristotelian model of thinking about these things was that basically sentient life was there at the service of humankind. The flora and the fauna of the world was there for us. And I think more and more people are making the connection that we are so interdependent, that we humans cannot exist as a species if we don't allow biodiversity to also exist in all its forms, as a species, flora and fauna. and that the interconnectedness is something that we desperately need. And so as we face the huge challenge of climate change, and perhaps not our generation as such, but our children's generation will have these monumental problems. We have to take the carbon mitigation measures required of us, and they will be utterly drastic. We've seen, and we have to get our minds over this. We can't just say that this is politically impossible. Well, extinction is the alternative eventually, and that's even more impossible for us to want to hope for. And this other idea that some will have us believe that the only way to save ourselves, because we cannot believe that we can make things better on Earth, is to then establish a human colony on Mars as a way of solving this problem is unfortunate, because there are ways to do it. It just requires us to change in a very distinct manner. David Attenborough has sort of spelt it out, saying we need to stabilize the global population at about 12 billion. We need to take measures like perhaps reducing travel, reducing the reduction of meat consumption, and the things that we can do as individuals to make this world hospitable, not just for us, but for all the species that are now, biodiversity that is now under severe strain and threat. And in one way, the Sustainable Development Goals will take us in that direction, but we need to do even more than that.
Maybe, if I may, before going to sort of that the radical change and sort of how we enforce that and how we do that going forward, if we could just talk about the biodiversity piece, because I'm really curious why steps have been taken on sort of overall climate goals, but why is it that biodiversity has fallen so badly between the cracks and no progress has been made on getting towards those goals that were set back in 2010? What do you think the reason is for that?
Well, I think, when you isolate a particular issue, we can all come to an agreement quite quickly. We can all say human rights are fundamentally important, fundamental freedoms are important. We can say that rescuing biodiversity is important. The trick and the challenge is how we abide by those commitments when there are other competing interests. So the mining sector is a very powerful sector in many sort of the advanced economies. And the moment you start speaking in those terms, the mining sector is likely to make itself heard and felt. And you find governments then backtracking or shaking their heads or wringing their hands. And clearly, what we need to think about is a world where we recycle much more and dig up much less. We can't, pillaging the world, the earth, at the expense of our own existence. I mean, it's like a parasite living off the host until the host dies, and then the parasite dies, and that's where we are. I mean, it's essentially a parasitic way of living. And the earth can only give so much before it's utterly exhausted. And it's reaching that point of exhaustion. And we have to think differently. It's for our sakes, but it's for our sakes, not in a selfish way. I mean, we want to live in a world where the sky is blue, where we can breathe oxygen at sea level concentrations, where we can enjoy the flora and fauna and diversity of life. And it's not just the selfishness of us, of the human species. And we know also, as others have pointed out, Steven Pinker perhaps the most prominent, is that the kinder we are to other species, the more sensitive we are, the more sensitive we are to each other. It's not the opposite, which some may well argue. They'd say, well, let's just focus on human rights as opposed to the rights of flora and fauna and preserving ecosystems and biodiversity. We have enough worries about the human condition. We can't afford to expend more energy now worrying about the rest. No, we need to do all of it. And our children will curse us if we get to 2045 and we're all safely tucked away in our graves for the long sleep, and they are struggling with heat waves unimaginable by today's standards. I mean, And what we will leave for them is a very hostile environment. I mean, how selfish is that? And we claim to love our children and to care for them, and we devote our lives to raising them properly. Well, we don't if we're not going to take measures seriously. It demands extraordinary leadership, and that's perhaps the first challenge. And we will see now. I mean, President Joe Biden, newly elected in the U.S., we have so many of the global hopes are pinned on the U.S. Not just re-engaging with Paris, but offering a path for the rest of the world that can join us in this joint endeavor. And we have to hope that the geopolitical, competitions and infighting and fighting for markets and all of this is actually all secondary, because if we don't exist in the next 60 to 70 years in the way that we'd like to, for what reason would we worry whether GDP numbers are up in the next 2 or 3 years or not? I mean, yes, maybe for the purpose of an election, but it's so short-sighted and limiting. So one hopes that with this change in the US, there will be a healing inside the US first and foremost, and then on the basis of that, the leadership being expressed that can take this planet in the right direction, as opposed to wobbling into a very tragic next few decades.
But Zeid, in terms of speaking of leadership, and making changes at the top that will have impact sort of trickling down to the system and across the world. I mean, some of the initiatives that have been taken by some states to incorporate climate as part of the Constitution, to give it more teeth, if you will, is that effective? And also, if we sort of circle back to the use or the principles of human rights and climate and overlay the two, would that give more teeth to the ability to do something about it through the court system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hugely positive thing that a number of countries, New Zealand, within India itself, and Ecuador, have designated particular ecosystems, rivers and lakes, or basically conferred what's called personhood rights to them, that they have the right to exist equivalent to that of human beings. The importance of this is that a government that is basically defaulting on its obligation toward the protection of that system can then be taken to court, theoretically at least. I think that is surely a good thing. You basically have many states designate reservations, nature reserves. There are lists of species that are being threatened, both fauna and flora. And if governments are not taking their responsibilities seriously, and they've provided for this sort of thing in law, then it's a good thing. They're holding themselves to a high mark. And that's the way we need to think about these things. We need rather more dramatic action, not just vague promises, goals set, targets agreed to, and then nothing happens. Yeah? They need to be squeezed by their own populations who will say, I'm sorry. If we have a certain species of bird life or wildlife, and that it's being threatened, I mean, it will disappear very quickly. You have an obligation to find a way to make it work. And this argument that it's either one or the other, that we either, spend money on the military or spend money on butter or bread, or, we need clever economists to think how it is that you sequence this to make it all work. It requires good governance. Good governance is hard. You need great competency within government machinery. Most governments don't have great competency all the way through. They have some really good, competent parts, and then there are less competent parts. And that has to change. We are really reaching a desperate level in terms of our future. And we need not just scientists and technologists. We need those who are thinking ethically about AI and thinking about where science is going and devoting it to these greater causes, as opposed to fighting between each other over market share, continuing to plunder and pillage the globe as if it's inexhaustible when it is exhaustible. That has to sort of change. It's almost like, we have to emerge from being childlike into being something more mature if we're going to be worthy of continued life on this planet.
Zeid, I'm wondering on that note whether you can imagine a world in which the climate gets held on par with human rights to an extent in which that if targets are missed and overstepped, or species are not being protected sufficiently, would there be a lawsuit? Would that be a criminal act? Where would we uphold that? Who would hold others to account? What system would we use?
Yeah, well, there are initiatives underway. I can't go into them now, but at a later stage I could be. Initiatives thinking about how we do this, thinking about not just having one or two countries, New Zealand and Ecuador, do the right thing, but many more countries following suit. And then what sort of structure can you put in place to press the point? One of the lessons we've learned from human rights, but it's also in the atomic field, in the nuclear field, is that you can have treaties and conventions, but you point to something very important. You need some form of assuring that what it is that governments say they're doing is confirmed by a series of inspections, a more intrusive sort of verification of what it is governments are doing. So if a government has a particular species on the IUCN's sort of endangered list, and says it's doing everything it can to protect the species, that you have a means of actually verifying that this is the case. And I'm not sure it exists at the moment. I think it's more of a voluntary system. And I'm not an expert, but this is my impression. And I think we need to think of a world where, because we're so interconnected, what happens in your country affects me and mine, that I need to be assured that you are responsible because I'm affected by what it is that you do. And that's the system ultimately we need in place. And again, I think many of us who are in our, let's say, middle-aged, will probably have something of a relatively normal existence if we all live long enough. But I think for our children and their children, it will be vastly different and very difficult unless we ourselves do the right thing before we leave and exit the scene.
On your point, Zeid, on the world being interconnected is something obviously we're feeling more acutely than ever with the COVID situation. But to a point you were making earlier on leadership and the capacity to spend, and you say we can actually spend and we can focus on many things at once. But I might, if I may, bring you just to your thinking concerns around what is COVID going to do to this debate? Is it hollowing out our capacity to not just spend on climate initiatives, but even think about climate initiatives? Or has it done the latter? So what do you think the impact, as we emerge from this and dust ourselves off, what do you think the impact of COVID will have on this debate?
Well, you can see, for instance, the first effect was how closely connected we all are. And that the idea that nationalism is the answer to our problems is ridiculous because a coronavirus out of Wuhan has infected the entire planet. And a nationalistic response actually only makes it worse because within the nationalism, you will have selfishness with the elites grabbing the vaccine before anyone else. The whole system will be so corrupted and break down along lines which are hardly enlightened. No, we need to take this opportunity when we all face an existential threat to understand that only by solving problems together will we be able to exist as a race, and not just as a race, but in keeping also and through the preservation of biodiversity around us. The plundering of the planet has to be kept within bounds. We have to recycle much more. We have to think of different manufacturing processes. And we can't just continue doing the same old, which we've been doing since the Industrial Revolution. That has to change somehow. And even before that.
That's a very good a list of actions that we can all take today as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, there are things, changing patterns of consumption, changing the economic life will change when we do invest, much more in renewable energy. It was interesting to see Larry Fink only a few days ago, or maybe yesterday, commit BlackRock to a much stronger sort of environmental agenda. And when you have investment firms, asset management firms, follow suit, with the amount of liquidity we have in the capital markets today, we can really, do a great deal. And I believe those who say that the renewable industry, once it gets going, will offer opportunities to young people in the way that, we can't imagine now. But that surely must be the way to go. And it requires a real sort of principled leadership, not worried and concerned every minute about elections. Yes, we do need, good leadership to last in government. It's terrible if you have a good leader who's doing the right thing, but not populist and unpopular when it comes to some of the economic measures, and then is thrown out because they're thinking longer term. And we need to think longer term. And sometimes it will require pain. We've all had to forego, the sorts of lifestyles well, not all of us, because that's the privileged ones among us. We've had to forego a lifestyle that we've long been used to. Those who are living marginal existence don't have that benefit, and understand very well that they're going to suffer again disproportionately because of the way that we have been handling global affairs over the last, few decades.
I guess on the Larry, and just last question, Zeid, but I guess the sort of to sort of round it off and sort of bring it back to where we started on the sort of the linkages between human rights and climate change. We have COP taking place this year, and I'm wondering what you were talking about Larry Fink, and there is a lot of capacity and a lot of money out there that sort of if that changes its mindset along with governments and individuals, there really is an opportunity to make great strides in this. And it seems to me that on the horizon, COP would be a place to put some concrete things on the table and make some decisions. What are your hopes for COP? What would you like to see come out of that? What would be your recommendations? And maybe if you could look at that from, overall targets, but also from the perspective of human rights and climate.
Yeah, so what will it take to achieve a 1.5 increase in global temperature? It would take a 45% reduction relative to 2010 in CO2 by 2030, and a 100% net zero reduction, or let's say net zero emissions by 2050. And so there has to be a commitment that is met in terms of carbon mitigation. I mean, that is the critical piece of this. And we haven't been doing this, and somehow we have to basically commit ourselves to it. And we've seen a reduction in carbon emissions, but not at levels that we would otherwise want to see. I mean, so it's been 10%, and I've seen numbers that have been higher than that. But we need 45% reduction by 2030. So, and that's only 10 years away. So it's going to take a Herculean effort, and it has to, be a painstaking sort of explanation to a population that yes, there may be changes. I mean, we see the riots, for instance, in the Netherlands because of the lockdowns. There may be changes, but ultimately it's our own existence that's at stake. This is should or and ought to be a non-negotiable issue. The question is, I think that global inequalities makes it seem deeply unfair. People who are basically eking out a living in the industrialized North or in the global South, just making sure they have enough money to pay rent, to feed their children, to send them to school, feel, damn it, you're asking us to sacrifice even more. And yet, we have all these wealthy elites, jet setting around the world, living it up. And we can see this on the internet. It's fed into our lives every day and creates enormous acidity and bitterness in our hearts toward them. And you're asking us to make the sacrifices? Why don't they make the sacrifices? Why don't they contribute more? Why isn't there a tax on the, the top 100 billionaires? Why, do they see it only in economic terms and not see it in more human terms? And those are appropriate questions to ask, and they need to be asked because we see a cliff edge by 2050, and we're marching toward it quite quickly. And so I think that, perhaps with the change now of leadership in the United States, and if we see more investment firms like BlackRock make these commitments and then force the capital markets to think more about divesting out of those industries that are very rich when it comes to carbon emissions, and to plow investments into science and technology where renewables are concerned, then we are making good on that commitment. But if we don't see it, if it's just statements and speeches, and goodness knows we're sick of all of those speeches and public statements, we need to see proper commitments that are being met, and they need to be verified as well. So I think let's hope, and with let's say with the pressure of people increasingly worried about the state of the planet, not least because our children demand it of us, then perhaps the political thinking can change in its narrow sense towards something more enlightened.
Thank you, Zeid. As always, amazing to talk to you, and I hope you're right that we have reached some form of tipping point where it's less talk and more walk that the world needs to see and wants to see now. Wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you soon, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.